The moment Arlo Elwood's small hand closed around Marius Devreux's silk tie, every conversation in Il Veluto Nero died as if someone had cut the power to the room itself. The boy's fingers trembled but didn't release their grip, his 7-year-old frame dwarfed by the towering presence of the man whose expensive fabric he now held hostage. His knuckles had gone white from the pressure, yet his eyes burned with something far more dangerous than fear. "One of your guys made my mom cry all night long," Arlo said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence with the kind of clarity that only desperation can produce. Marius had been mid-sentence when the interruption occurred, discussing shipment routes with 3 associates, whose expressions now oscillated between shock and the urge to intervene. But the man at the center remained perfectly still, his dark eyes dropping to meet the child's gaze with an intensity that would have shattered most adults. The restaurant's ambient music continued its soft strings, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, while candlelight danced across crystal glasses that no one dared lift. Marius studied the boy with the patience of someone accustomed to extracting truth from silence, noting the worn jacket that had been mended at the elbows and the dirt beneath small fingernails. The child's stance spoke of rehearsed confrontation, yet his eyes betrayed the terror of actually executing it. Every breath the boy took seemed to cost him something precious. "Release the tie," Marius said quietly, each word measured and deliberate, carrying no threat but absolute authority that made the air itself feel heavier. Arlo's grip loosened fractionally, but his feet remained planted, as if surrendering the fabric meant losing his only leverage in a world where he possessed none. His chest rose and fell in visible rhythm, betraying the panic his face refused to show. The 3 associates shifted in their seats, hands moving toward concealed weapons with practiced subtlety, but a single raised finger from Marius stopped them cold. His focus never wavered from the boy who had dared touch what others wouldn't approach without invitation. "Your mother's name," Marius stated, the words emerging without inflection, neither kind nor cruel, simply delivered as if discussing tonight's wine selection, rather than an accusation threatening carefully maintained order. Arlo swallowed hard before answering, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, yet somehow carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "Marin Elwood. She works here sometimes, in the kitchen." Something flickered in Marius's expression, gone so quickly it might have been imagined, but the boy caught it and found courage in that microscopic crack. His shoulders straightened slightly, gaining an inch of height that changed nothing physically, yet altered everything about the dynamic between them. "I saw the black car outside our building last night," Arlo continued, his words gaining momentum now that he'd started speaking. "The same one that parks here every Tuesday and Friday." The observation landed with unexpected weight, drawing a barely perceptible narrowing of Marius's eyes that suggested the child had noticed more than he should have. One of the associates leaned forward as if to speak, but a subtle headshake silenced him before sound could form. Marius reached for the glass of water beside his plate, his movements slow and deliberate, designed to communicate he wasn't reaching for anything threatening. He slid it across the polished table toward Arlo, the gesture carrying more meaning than words could convey. The boy stared at the offered glass, but made no move to accept it, his small frame rigid with the understanding that taking anything might signal trust he couldn't afford. The water sat untouched between them, a symbol of the chasm neither had yet decided to cross or acknowledge. A waiter materialized from the kitchen's direction, carrying plates destined for another table, but froze mid-step when he registered the scene unfolding at Marius's table. His training warred with instinct, professionalism demanding he continue, while self-preservation insisted on retreat, until Marius's subtle head movement released him to complete his task. Arlo's legs had begun to ache from standing so long, adrenaline no longer sufficient to mask the physical toll of his journey across town on foot. He'd walked 17 blocks through neighborhoods that grew progressively more dangerous as darkness fell, driven by singular purpose that overrode every survival lesson his mother had drilled into him about strangers and empty streets. The restaurant's other patrons had resumed their conversations in hushed tones, stealing glances toward the confrontation, while pretending absorption in their own meals. Their curiosity manifested as performance, each diner playing the role of someone too sophisticated to openly stare, while their attention remained magnetically drawn to the boy who disrupted their evening's carefully constructed atmosphere. Marius reached into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, extracting a handkerchief that he placed on the table between them without explanation. Arlo looked at the offered cloth in confusion, until he realized his own face was streaked with tears. He hadn't noticed falling, his body expressing distress his mind refused to acknowledge. Marius leaned back in his chair with calculated ease, the leather creaking softly beneath his weight as he continued to assess the boy who refused to retreat. His fingers drummed once against the table's edge, a rhythm that his associates recognized as the precursor to decisions that altered lives. The chandelier above cast shadows across his face that made reading his thoughts impossible. "You believe one of my men hurt your mother," he said, the statement hanging in perfumed air thick with tension and expensive cologne. Arlo nodded, his jaw set with determination that seemed borrowed from someone much older, someone who had learned that silence could be as damaging as action. His eyes never left Marius's face, searching for something he couldn't name, but would recognize if he found it. "I don't believe things," Marius continued, his voice dropping to a register that made everyone lean slightly forward to catch each word. "I verify them." The distinction seemed lost on the boy at first, but understanding dawned slowly across his young features like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He processed the implication that truth mattered here, that accusations without foundation would be treated differently than those with substance. Marius gestured to the associate on his left, a man with silver threading his temples and scars that spoke of decades in service. The associate rose without hesitation, extracting a phone from his jacket, with movements that suggested he'd performed this ritual countless times before. "Describe the car," Marius commanded Arlo, his attention now fully focused on extracting details that would either validate or dismantle the boy's story. Arlo's response came quick and precise, demonstrating an eye for detail that surprised even the hardened men at the table. Black sedan, scratched rear bumper on the driver's side, license plate starting with 73H. The specificity silenced any doubt about whether he'd actually witnessed what he claimed. The associate with the phone stepped away toward the restaurant's entrance, already making calls that would set invisible wheels in motion throughout Bend. Marius watched him go before returning his full attention to Arlo, whose stance had shifted from confrontational to something approaching cautious hope. "Sit," Marius said, indicating the empty chair beside him with a slight nod that carried the weight of instruction rather than invitation. Arlo hesitated, his survival instincts warring with the exhaustion that suddenly seemed to crash over him like a wave he'd been holding back through sheer will. He moved to the chair slowly, perching on its edge, as if ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. A server appeared from the kitchen, her professional mask barely concealing her curiosity about the unprecedented scene unfolding at the most powerful table in the restaurant. She set down a plate of bread and olive oil without being asked, then vanished as quickly as she'd materialized. "When did you last eat?" The question came unexpectedly from Marius, cutting through the tension with a practicality that seemed at odds with everything the moment represented. His cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but hunger won out over pride as his hand reached tentatively toward the bread, fingers stopping inches from the plate as if expecting someone to slap them away. When no reprimand came, he took a piece and tore it smaller, chewing slowly to make it last longer, while his eyes darted between the food and Marius's face. The olive oil pooled in its small dish, golden and fragrant with herbs Arlo couldn't name, representing a luxury so far removed from his daily experience it might as well have been liquid gold. He dipped the bread edge carefully, watching excess oil drip back before bringing it to his mouth, the flavor exploding across his tongue with intensity that momentarily displaced his fear. Marius observed this careful rationing with an expression that revealed nothing, though something shifted in his posture that suggested the boy's poverty had registered on some internal ledger he maintained. He gestured to the server who'd brought the bread, murmuring instructions too low for Arlo to hear, sending her back toward the kitchen with purpose written in her quickened stride. Within minutes she returned carrying a plate of pasta and cream sauce, setting it before Arlo with a gentleness that suggested she had children of her own at home. The boy looked at Marius for permission he shouldn't have needed to seek, and received a single nod that transformed the meal from test to genuine offering. Arlo's stomach answered before his mouth could, growling audibly in the relative quiet that had settled over their corner of the room. His cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but hunger won out over pride as his hand reached tentatively toward the bread. Marius observed the boy's careful movements, noting how he tore the bread into smaller pieces, as if making it last longer, as if meals weren't guaranteed. The two remaining associates exchanged glances that communicated entire conversations without words, recognizing something in their boss's demeanor that they'd rarely witnessed. 23 minutes passed in near silence before the associate returned, his expression carved from stone, but his eyes conveying urgency that made Marius rise from his seat. The whispered exchange between them lasted only seconds, but Arlo watched every micro-expression, every subtle shift in body language that adults thought children couldn't interpret. He understood enough to know his mother's name had been confirmed, that the car had been traced. "Come," Marius said to Arlo, the single word carrying finality that allowed no room for negotiation or questions about destination. The boy slid from his chair, legs unsteady from the adrenaline that had sustained him finally beginning to ebb and leave him hollowed out. Marius moved toward the exit with purposeful strides that didn't rush yet, covered ground with efficiency, expecting Arlo to follow without checking if he did. The night air hit them like a physical force as they stepped outside, the temperature having dropped significantly since Arlo had entered the warmth of Il Veluto Nero. The black car that appeared at the curb wasn't the one from outside their building, but it carried the same aura of authority and unspoken threat. Arlo climbed into the back seat, sinking into leather that smelled of cedar and something darker he couldn't identify but made his skin prickle. Marius settled beside him, maintaining distance that somehow felt more present than if he'd sat close, his silence filling the space between them with unasked questions. The associate who'd made the calls took the driver's seat, starting the engine with a purr that spoke of maintenance and money most residents of Arlo's neighborhood would never encounter. They pulled away from the river's edge, heading toward the industrial section, where Ben's polished surface gave way to raw functionality. Streetlights grew sparse as they drove, replaced by the occasional fluorescent glow from warehouse loading docks and 24-hour machine shops. Arlo pressed his face to the window, watching his reflection ghost across darkened buildings that loomed like sleeping giants in the November cold. "Whatever you see in the next few minutes," Marius said without looking at the boy, his words measured and deliberate as always, "understand that it happened because systems failed." The statement hung cryptic and heavy between them, offering neither comfort nor warning, but something in between that Arlo's 7-year-old mind struggled to categorize. He nodded anyway, sensing that acknowledgement mattered more than comprehension in this moment. They turned down a gravel road that led to a structure set back from the main thoroughfare, its metal siding reflecting moonlight in patches where rust hadn't claimed dominance. The car's headlights swept across a loading bay door that stood partially raised, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to breathe with malevolent purpose. Marius exited first, his movements fluid despite the tension that had settled across his shoulders, like an invisible mantle of responsibility and impending violence. He waited for Arlo to emerge before walking toward the bay door, his presence somehow making the shadows retreat without additional light. 2 figures materialized from inside the warehouse, both wearing expressions that shifted from casual alertness to shock when they recognized who approached. Their hands moved away from weapons they'd been casually holding, bodies straightening into postures that communicated respect mixed with fear and confusion about why their boss had arrived unannounced. "Where is she?" Marius's voice cut through the space between them like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath, quiet, but carrying edge enough to draw blood. One of the men gestured deeper into the warehouse, his throat working visibly as he swallowed whatever excuse or explanation he'd been formulating. Marius moved past them without waiting for verbal response, trusting Arlo to follow as they penetrated further into the building's industrial heart. The smell hit first, a combination of motor oil, rust, and human fear that Arlo recognized from the night before when his mother had returned home trembling. His steps slowed, dread pooling in his stomach as shapes resolved in the dim emergency lighting that provided the only illumination. Marin Elwood sat bound to a metal chair in the center of the space, her head hanging forward so dark hair obscured her face, wrists secured with zip ties that had cut into her skin. She didn't look up at the sound of approaching footsteps, remaining motionless in a way that made Arlo's heart stop, before her chest's subtle rise confirmed she still breathed. The concrete floor beneath her chair was stained with water from a bucket tipped on its side, evidence of interrogation techniques that relied on psychological pressure rather than physical brutality. Her work uniform was soaked through, clinging to her frame in a way that made her appear even more fragile than her actual build suggested, though Arlo knew the strength hidden beneath his mother's deceptively delicate exterior. Marius's jaw tightened as he took in the scene, his anger manifesting not in expression, but in the absolute stillness that overtook him, the kind of calm that preceded volcanic eruptions. The 2 guards shifted nervously, finally understanding that their boss's unexpected arrival signaled consequences they'd been too short-sighted to anticipate when following Garrett's orders. Blood had dried beneath Marin's nose, a thin trail that suggested someone had struck her face hours ago, the evidence of violence making Arlo's vision blur red at the edges. His small hands clenched into fists that could do nothing against grown men, fury and helplessness warring inside his chest until he couldn't distinguish between the two emotions anymore. The emergency lighting cast shadows that moved with disturbing independence, creating the illusion of additional figures lurking in the warehouse's darker corners, where industrial equipment loomed like sleeping monsters. Somewhere in the building's depths, machinery hummed with low-frequency vibration that Arlo felt through his shoes, the sound underlining this moment with mechanical indifference to human suffering. "Cut her loose," Marius commanded, his voice carrying across the warehouse with the kind of authority that transformed suggestion into inevitability without requiring volume. The two men who'd been standing guard exchanged uncertain glances before one produced a folding knife from his pocket, moving toward Marin with visible reluctance. His hands shook slightly as he severed the plastic restraints, the sound of each tie snapping punctuating the heavy silence that had settled over the space. Arlo broke free from where he'd been frozen, rushing forward before anyone could stop him, his small body colliding with his mother's knees. Marin's head lifted at the impact, confusion giving way to recognition that flooded her features with relief and terror in equal measure. "Baby, what are you doing here? What are—" Her voice emerged hoarse and fractured, as if speaking required navigating around broken glass lodged in her throat. Marius watched the reunion with an expression that revealed nothing, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when Marin's eyes met his over Arlo's head. The look she gave him contained questions layered so deep they'd take hours to excavate, but beneath them all was the fundamental one that mattered most. "Your son has impressive observation skills," Marius said, addressing Marin directly for the first time, while Arlo clung to her with the desperate strength of someone who'd believed he might never hold her again. Marin's gaze shifted to the two men who'd been keeping her captive, her expression hardening into something that suggested she'd remember their faces for whatever remained of her life. They couldn't meet her eyes, both finding sudden interest in the oil-stained concrete beneath their feet. Who authorized this? Marius turned to face them fully now, his posture shifting subtly into something more dangerous than his previous calm had suggested possible. The taller of the two men cleared his throat, words coming out strangled and desperate. Garrett said she'd seen something during a delivery last month, that she posed a risk to operations. The name landed like a stone thrown through glass, shattering whatever thin pretense of legitimacy might have existed for Marin's imprisonment. Marius's expression transformed from neutral assessment to cold calculation that made the temperature in the warehouse seem to drop several degrees. His movements carried the efficiency of someone executing a protocol they'd rehearsed, but hoped never to implement, each gesture economical and precise as he relayed coordinates and instructions to whoever answered his call. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but its brevity only emphasized the weight of what had been set in motion with those few exchanged words. The taller guard began backing toward the warehouse's rear exit, his survival instinct finally overriding whatever loyalty or fear had kept him in place until now. He made it 3 steps before Marius's voice stopped him without rising in volume, the command carrying authority that transformed his legs to concrete mid-stride. "Nobody leaves until this is resolved," Marius stated, the sentence structured as observation rather than threat, as if departure had already been rendered impossible by forces beyond anyone's control. Marin lifted her head finally, the movement requiring visible effort as neck muscles stiff from hours of forced stillness protested the change in position. Her eyes found Marius first, then tracked to where Arlo stood frozen between rushing to her and maintaining the distance adult tension demanded, her expression cycling through confusion and recognition and something approaching understanding about who had orchestrated her release. "Garrett doesn't make those decisions," he said quietly, each word precisely articulated in a way that made them more threatening than any shouted accusation could have been. The associate who'd driven them stepped forward from where he'd been standing near the entrance, phone already in hand and pressing buttons that would summon others. His movements carried the efficiency of someone executing a protocol they'd rehearsed, but hoped never to implement. Marius crouched down to Arlo's eye level, waiting until the boy reluctantly released his mother enough to look at him. "You were right to come find me," he said, the acknowledgement carrying weight that transformed it from simple statement into something approaching respect. "Can we go home now?" Arlo asked, his voice small again now that the adrenaline had fully drained away, leaving behind only exhaustion and the trembling aftermath of fear. Marius stood, considering the question, with the same seriousness he'd given everything else tonight, as if the boy's request deserved genuine deliberation rather than automatic dismissal. He glanced at Marin, whose arms had wrapped protectively around her son, despite the obvious pain movement caused her. Not yet, he answered, pulling his phone from an inner jacket pocket and pressing a single contact. There are arrangements that need to be made first. The call connected immediately, and Marius spoke in low tones that didn't carry beyond a few feet, his free hand gesturing in subtle movements that communicated instructions without requiring elaboration. When he ended the conversation, he turned back to find Marin watching him with an intensity that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew. The safe house Marius arranged sat on Ben's western edge, where residential neighborhoods gave way to properties measured in acres rather than lots. Morning light filtered through curtains that hadn't been drawn in months, illuminating dust particles that danced in the disturbed air like microscopic witnesses to their arrival. Marin moved through the space with cautious steps, one hand trailing along furniture that bore no personal marks of ownership, the generic quality of temporary shelter. Arlo had fallen asleep in the car during the drive, his small body finally surrendering to exhaustion that had been building for over 24 hours. "A doctor will arrive within the hour," Marius informed her, his presence filling the doorway between kitchen and living area without actually entering either space. She turned to face him, arms crossed in a posture that might have been defensive if not for the way her fingers pressed against bruises forming along her ribs. "Why are you doing this?" The question emerged without accusation, genuine curiosity coloring words that under different circumstances might have sounded like challenge. "Your son risked everything to find me," Marius replied, his gaze drifting toward where Arlo lay curled on the couch. Children don't make those decisions lightly. The observation hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to fully examine, though both recognized truth in the assessment. Marin's expression softened fractionally, exhaustion making it harder to maintain the walls she'd instinctively erected against this man whose world had collided so violently with hers. "I didn't see anything," she said quietly, needing him to know this fundamental fact, even if it changed nothing about what had already transpired. "I was just working." Marius nodded slowly, as if this confirmation aligned with conclusions he'd already reached through channels she couldn't access. "Garrett operates on fear rather than intelligence," he explained, his tone suggesting this represented a failure of character, rather than simple strategic error. "What happens to him?" Marin found herself asking despite uncertainty about whether she truly wanted to know the answer. "That depends on many factors," Marius said, his vagueness deliberate, and somehow more unsettling than explicit description would have been. "But you won't see him again." The promise carried absolute certainty that made Marin's stomach tighten with understanding about the kind of finality his words implied. She looked away first, unable to hold his gaze while processing the reality that her safety had been purchased with someone else's destruction. "The restaurant," she began, then stopped, unsure how to articulate the question about whether she still had employment, or if that life had ended the moment Garrett decided she represented a threat. "We'll hold your position," Marius finished for her, demonstrating the kind of awareness that suggested he'd already considered practical concerns she was only beginning to catalog, with appropriate compensation for missed shifts. Marin laughed once, a sound without humor that acknowledged the absurdity of discussing payroll after being held captive in a warehouse. The laugh died quickly, replaced by silence that felt less hostile than the one that had preceded it. "I don't understand any of this," she admitted, exhaustion stripping away her ability to maintain pretense or careful social navigation around dangerous truths. Marius moved further into the room finally, maintaining distance but closing the gap enough that conversation no longer required raised voices. "Your son walked into a room full of armed men and grabbed my tie," he said, something resembling admiration threading through his measured tone. "He's 7, Marin countered, as if age explained or excused the recklessness that had somehow resulted in her freedom, rather than compounding tragedy. "Exactly," Marius replied, the single word carrying meaning that suggested Arlo's youth, made his courage more remarkable rather than less. That innocence weaponized by desperation possessed power that calculated violence couldn't match. 5 days passed before Marin felt steady enough to venture beyond the safe house's carefully maintained perimeter. 5 days of healing skin and processing trauma that kept reshaping itself every time she closed her eyes. The doctor had come and gone 3 times, asking no questions beyond those relevant to her physical recovery, his discretion purchased long before he'd arrived. Arlo had returned to school on the 3rd day, driven by one of Marius's associates who looked distinctly uncomfortable, navigating elementary school pickup protocols. The boy had adjusted with the resilience children possess when adults provide no alternative, asking questions Marin couldn't fully answer about when normal would resume. The decision to return to Il Voluto Nero came suddenly, crystallizing over breakfast, when Maren realized she couldn't hide indefinitely from the place where her life had fractured. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that covered the fading bruises while maintaining the professional appearance the restaurant's atmosphere demanded. Walking through the front entrance felt surreal, as if she'd stepped into a parallel version of reality, where everything looked identical, but operated under different physical laws. Staff members she'd worked beside for months offered tentative smiles that contained pity and curiosity in equal measure, making her skin itch with the awareness of being discussed. The kitchen manager appeared within minutes, his relief visible as he ushered her toward his cramped office and closed the door against interested ears. "We weren't sure you'd come back," he admitted, running a hand through thinning hair in a gesture that spoke of stress she'd inadvertently caused. "I need to work," Maren said simply, the truth of it undeniable, even as she recognized the complicated layers beneath the statement about identity and normalcy, and refusing to let fear dictate her existence. He nodded, understanding more than she'd actually spoken, then explained her schedule had been adjusted to day shifts exclusively, no evenings or late nights. The change came without explanation, but its source was obvious: protection implemented without requiring her request or consent. She worked through lunch service with mechanical efficiency, muscle memory carrying her through tasks, while her mind wandered paths she couldn't quite follow to conclusions. The rhythm of kitchen work provided unexpected comfort, its demands leaving no room for spiraling thoughts about warehouse shadows and zip ties. When the lunch rush ended and the kitchen staff took their break, Maren found herself unable to sit still, restless energy driving her toward movement. She pushed through the door separating kitchen from dining area, intending only to walk the perimeter and breathe air less saturated with cooking oil. Marius sat at his usual table despite the early hour, paperwork spread before him in organized chaos that suggested business conducted away from traditional offices. He looked up when she entered, some quality of awareness making him track her movement before her presence could logically register. She approached without planning to, each step a decision made and implemented before conscious thought could interfere, until she stood beside his table with heart hammering against ribs that still protested deep breaths. From her pocket, she withdrew a small object, placing it on the polished wood between them with careful precision. The button sat there, dark and ordinary, torn from the shirt he'd worn that first night when Arlo had grabbed his tie. Maren had found it on the warehouse floor, where it must have fallen during some moment she couldn't reconstruct, had carried it for days while deciding what its discovery meant. "I thought you might want this back," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she'd expected given the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Marius studied the button for a long moment before his gaze lifted to her face, searching for something she wasn't certain she wanted him to find. "Keep it," he said finally, pushing it back toward her with one finger. "Why would I want your button?" The question emerged sharper than intended, frustration and confusion bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "Because now we both have something that doesn't belong to us," he replied, the cryptic response typical of how he seemed to communicate, in layers that required excavation to fully comprehend. Maren picked up the button again, rolling it between her fingers and feeling its weight that seemed disproportionate to its actual mass. "Are we even?" she asked, needing to understand the balance sheet of debt and obligation that his actions had created between them. "Nobody gets even after what happened," Marius said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than apologetic, stating reality without attempting to soften its edges. "But we can move forward." 3 weeks dissolved into the rhythm of reconstructed normalcy, with Maren working her adjusted schedule and Arlo attending school under watchful eyes that never revealed themselves, but made their presence known through absence of threat. The safe house had been abandoned after the first week, Maren returning to her own apartment to find the lock changed and a new deadbolt installed that felt heavier than the old one. The laundrette appeared on a Tuesday morning in the industrial quarter where businesses struggled to survive between quarterly tax assessments and rising rent. Its sign hung slightly crooked above a door painted deep blue, the color choice deliberate in its refusal to blend with the grays and browns dominating the neighborhood. Maren discovered it while taking an unfamiliar route home from the market, her arms full of groceries that threatened to tear through recycled paper bags. She stopped walking when the sign registered, her breath catching on recognition she couldn't immediately explain until details aligned into understanding. The property had been vacant for 8 months, its previous owner fleeing debt collectors who'd eventually seized equipment that wasn't worth the effort of resale. Now machines hummed behind clean windows, their industrial efficiency speaking of recent installation and careful selection by someone who understood commercial laundry operations. A small card taped to the door listed operating hours and prices that undercut every competitor within 10 miles, making survival possible where profit would take longer to materialize. No owner's name appeared anywhere on the signage, just a phone number that connected to an answering service when Marin called from the sidewalk. She entered slowly, the bell above the door announcing her presence to the empty space where washers churned through their cycles with rhythmic precision. The smell of industrial detergent mixed with something cleaner underneath, perhaps hope or possibility, or the scent of second chances that couldn't be bottled. A woman emerged from the back office, middle-aged with capable hands and eyes that assessed Marin with professional interest rather than personal curiosity. "We're hiring if you're looking," she said without preamble, as if reading intention from body language alone. "I have a job," Marin replied automatically, then found herself adding, "but I might know someone who needs work." The woman nodded, producing a business card from her apron pocket with contact information and an invitation to call any time. Marin accepted it, fingers brushing paper that felt heavier than its physical weight could account for. Understanding settling over her like snow, accumulating in silence. That evening she stood in her kitchen staring at the card while Arlo worked on homework at their small table, his concentration absolute as he navigated multiplication tables that seemed more comprehensible than the adult world he'd glimpsed. The button from Marius's shirt sat in a dish beside the sink, where she'd placed it without conscious decision, its presence a reminder of debts that couldn't be calculated. "Mom?" Arlo's voice pulled her back to the present. His pencil paused mid-equation as he watched her with concern that children shouldn't need to carry. "Just thinking, baby," she assured him, forcing a smile that felt more genuine than she'd expected, some knot inside her loosening fractionally. The next morning she detoured past the laundrette again, this time noting details she'd missed during the initial shock of discovery. The security cameras mounted at corners, discreet but comprehensive in their coverage. The reinforced door frame that spoke of protection without broadcasting vulnerability. The way the location sat positioned between her apartment and Arlo's school, geography transformed into strategy. She called the number that afternoon during her break, speaking with the manager who'd been expecting her contact, as if their meeting had been predetermined. A position was available, hours flexible around her restaurant schedule. Pay that matched what she currently earned for half the physical demand. Marin accepted without negotiating, understanding that some gifts arrived wrapped in employment contracts, that dignity could be preserved through the fiction of earned wages. She would work both jobs because pride demanded it, because she needed to prove to herself that survival didn't require constant rescue. The restaurant kitchen felt different when she returned to finish her shift, as if the space had shifted slightly while she'd been away making phone calls that rearranged her future. Her coworkers noticed the change in her posture, the way she moved through tasks with energy that had been absent since her return. When Marius appeared for an early dinner that evening, their eyes met across the dining room for a brief moment before she retreated to the kitchen. No words were exchanged. No acknowledgement beyond that single glance that communicated understanding too complex for language to contain. The threat materialized on a Thursday afternoon, when Arlo's school called to report he'd never arrived for dismissal, despite being present during morning attendance. Marin's hands went numb, gripping the phone, her vision tunneling as the receptionist's concerned voice outlined the timeline of his disappearance and the security footage being reviewed. She was halfway to her car when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number containing only an address in the industrial district and a timestamp, 30 minutes in the future. Her fingers shook so badly she could barely type a response before realizing none was expected or wanted. The drive passed in dissociated fragments, traffic lights and turn signals registering only as obstacles between her current location and wherever Arlo had been taken. Her mind supplied 1,000 scenarios, each more horrific than the last, until she forced herself to breathe and focus on navigation alone. The address led to a shipping facility that looked abandoned, its loading docks empty, and parking lot cracked from seasons of neglect and insufficient maintenance. Marin's car felt exposed, pulling into the open space, every instinct screaming that visibility meant vulnerability she couldn't afford. Marius's vehicle sat near the building's main entrance, its presence simultaneously terrifying and reassuring in ways that tangled her thoughts into knots. She parked beside it and emerged into cold air that bit through her jacket, November asserting dominance as winter approached. The door opened before she reached it, Marius appearing in the frame with an expression that stopped her forward momentum. "He's safe," he said immediately, recognizing panic when he saw it, and addressing the primary concern before others could spiral. Relief made her knees weak, but she steadied herself against the doorframe and demanded, "Where is he?" "Inside with my driver," Marius answered, stepping back to allow her entry into a space that smelled of dust and motor oil and recent violence she couldn't yet see evidence of. Arlo sat on a metal folding chair, clutching a juice box that someone had provided while adults handled situations he shouldn't have witnessed. He looked up when Marin entered, his expression caught between relief and residual fear that hadn't fully processed what had almost happened. She crossed the distance and pulled him against her, feeling his small body trembling despite his attempts to appear brave. Over his head, she met Marius's eyes, questions forming that she wasn't certain she wanted answered in her son's presence. "Someone from Garrett's crew decided to send a message," Marius explained, his tone flat and factual, reporting rather than editorializing about the attempted kidnapping that had been intercepted. "They won't send another." The certainty in his voice carried implications that Marin forced herself not to examine too closely, choosing ignorance about methodology while accepting the security his intervention provided. Her fingers stroked through Arlo's hair, grounding herself in his physical presence and the reality of his safety. "How did you know?" she asked, needing to understand the surveillance network that had protected her son when she couldn't. "I didn't stop watching after the safe house," Marius admitted, the confession delivered without apology or expectation of gratitude, simply stated as fact about precautions he'd implemented without requesting permission. Marin processed this revelation slowly, understanding that privacy had been sacrificed on the altar of protection, that her life had been monitored by invisible guardians since that night in the warehouse. The violation should have angered her, but exhaustion and relief left no room for outrage she couldn't sustain. "Thank you," she said finally, the words inadequate but necessary. Acknowledgement of debt that kept accumulating faster than she could calculate repayment terms. Marius nodded once, then gestured toward the door where his driver waited. "I'll have someone follow you home," he stated, the sentence structured as information rather than suggestion that could be declined. She didn't argue, gathering Arlo and moving toward the exit while Marius remained in the warehouse's interior, where she suspected other business still required his attention. The drive home passed in silence, her son processing trauma in whatever way 7-year-olds manage such things, while a black sedan maintained discreet distance 3 car lengths behind. Winter settled over Bend with the inevitability of seasons unconcerned with human drama, painting the Cascade Peaks in white that reflected sunlight until looking directly at them required squinting. The laundrette thrived against economic projections, its customer base growing through word-of-mouth recommendations from people who appreciated quality service at fair prices. Marin found rhythm in dividing her time between the restaurant's controlled chaos and the laundrette's methodical routines, each job providing something the other lacked. Arlo had stopped asking when the car would stop following them to school, accepting its presence as part of their new reality, the way children adapt to divorce or relocation. She saw Marius occasionally at Il Veluto Nero, their interactions limited to professional courtesy and careful distance that protected them both from complications neither seemed ready to navigate. He never asked about the laundrette's performance, and she never acknowledged his obvious involvement, maintaining fiction through mutual silence. The button remained in her kitchen, relocated to a small wooden box where she kept important documents and the few pieces of jewelry inherited from her grandmother. She'd catch herself looking at it sometimes while washing dishes, wondering what it meant that she'd kept something so ordinary, yet weighted with everything that had transpired. 3 months after the attempted kidnapping, Marin arrived at the restaurant to find an envelope with her name written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a receipt for a security system installation at her apartment building, comprehensive coverage that included her unit and common areas, paid in full for 5 years with maintenance included. No note accompanied the receipt. No explanation required for who had arranged the upgrade or why they'd chosen this particular way to ensure her continued safety. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her purse, adding it to the collection of gestures that spoke louder than any conversation they might have. Arlo's nightmares decreased in frequency as winter progressed toward spring, his sleep becoming less fractured by memories of being pulled from the playground by men whose faces he'd been too terrified to remember clearly. He'd started drawing again, his pictures featuring superheroes and dragons rather than the darker images that had filled his sketchbook immediately after the incident. The restaurant hosted a private event one evening in late February, a gathering that required all hands on deck as staff accommodated guests whose collective wealth exceeded the GDP of small nations. Marin worked the kitchen expediting orders while trying not to think about the armed security she'd noticed stationed at every exit. During a brief lull, she stepped outside for air, the cold shocking after hours in the kitchen's oppressive heat, and found Marius smoking a cigarette in the alley where staff took unauthorized breaks. He looked up at her approach but didn't move, simply exhaled smoke that dissipated into the night sky. "I didn't know you smoked," Marin said, immediately regretting the observation, as too personal for whatever boundaries they'd established without discussion. "I don't," he replied, then took another drag that contradicted the statement before crushing the cigarette under his shoe. Old habit that resurfaces under pressure. They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city at night creating backdrop ambiance that required no competition from conversation. Marin pulled her jacket tighter, less against cold than against the vulnerability of standing alone with him in darkness. "Your son is doing well," Marius said finally, the comment revealing that his monitoring hadn't ceased despite the passage of time and absence of additional threats. "He asks about you sometimes," Marin admitted, unsure why she chose to share this detail, except that honesty felt necessary in this moment of unguarded interaction. Marius's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, surprise perhaps, or something else she couldn't interpret in the inadequate lighting. "What do you tell him?" he asked, genuine curiosity coloring the question. "That you're someone who helped us when we needed it most," she answered simply, the truth stripped of complexity that would take years for Arlo to fully comprehend. "That sometimes people are more than they appear." He nodded slowly, accepting her characterization without comment or correction, allowing her version of events to stand unchallenged. The moment stretched between them, heavy with things unsaid that might never find expression in language either could speak comfortably. "I should get back," Marin said eventually, the kitchen calling her return before her absence became noticeable enough to generate questions. "Marin," Marius called, as she turned toward the door, her name sounding different in his voice than she'd heard it spoken before. She paused, looking back to find him watching her with intensity that made her pulse quicken. "The button you returned was from my favorite shirt." The confession hung in the cold air between them, vulnerable in its admission of attachment to material objects, suggesting that perhaps he too collected small reminders of the night that had altered multiple trajectories. She smiled slightly, understanding passing between them that required no verbal acknowledgement. Inside the restaurant's warmth, she resumed her position with renewed focus, but part of her awareness remained in that alley where smoke had curled into darkness and truths had been exchanged in fragments. When her shift ended hours later, she walked to her car and noticed for the first time the small object hanging from Marius's rearview mirror in the vehicle parked 3 spaces away. A button on a thin thread, swaying slightly in the heating system's artificial breeze, visible through his windshield like a message written in a language only they could read. Thank you all for following this story until the very end. If you enjoyed Arlo and Marin's journey, write in the comments what part touched you the most and where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support means everything and helps me bring you more stories like this one.